Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Professor Abisaab. So my name is Fuad Gihad Mirai. I'm a Berlin-based research fellow at the Alter Ummah project at the University of Birmingham. It's especially an honor and a pleasure of mine to chair this session actually with Professor Abisaab. As a scholar of Lebanon myself, she's really influenced me very much. So I'll very quickly introduce Professor Abisaab and her work, and then I will hand over to her. So Professor Abisaab is a professor of history and Islamic studies at the University of McGill in Montreal. Her research has included various aspects of Islamic and Shia history, focusing especially on the transformation of juristic thought and social and legal authority and the ulama. So in 2004, she published her book Converting Persia, which examined coagulations of Sufism, heterodoxy, and the role of the ulama in converting Iran, so to speak, and in the establishment of the Shia imperial state. Since then, she's developed an interest in public religion and militancy, building on her interest in Marxism, Islamism, and post-colonial Shia thinkers. And in 2014, unfortunately, shortly after I finished my PhD, she published her co-authored book, The Shiites of Lebanon, Modernism, Communism, and Hezbollah's Islamists, which, as I said, unfortunately came out shortly after I completed my PhD and made me reconsider and wish I could redo my research. So Rula scholarship has really inspired me, and I'm sure many others, to probe more systematically into the political thinking of post-colonial Shia thinkers and ulama, especially in contexts which, as Sajjad Rizvi alluded yesterday, in contexts that are cosmopolitan, where Shia ideologies meet other ideologies in other communities as well. So today she'll talk to us about an important figure in Lebanese and modern Shia thinking, Sheikh Muḥammad Jawād Mughniyya, whom some of you might be familiar with. He studied under Sayyid Abu al-Qasim al-Khou'i in Najaf, and was appointed the head of the highest Jafari court in Beirut. Although his legacy was somewhat sidelined or marginalized following his passing in 1979, of course, compared to others like Musa Sadr, Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, and others, he's a key figure in formulating Shia political thinking in Lebanon and beyond, of course. So without further ado, I will hand over to Rula, whose talk today is entitled The Red Cleric, Muḥammad Jawād Mughniyya's Anti-State Activism and Legal Reforms. Rula, you have up to 45 minutes. After that, I'll open the floor for questions and comments. I'd like to remind everyone that you can post your questions already in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen down there, or you could raise your digital hands and I will hand over the floor to you in Q&A. I'll remind you of this again at the end. This session, I want to remind you all, is being recorded. The keynote is being recorded, but the recording will be stopped before the Q&A session. So Professor Abisaab, without further ado, please imagine us digitally clapping you onto the stage. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Professor Mirai. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I would like to take this moment to thank Professor Sharbat for this amazing effort in bringing all of these exciting panels together. Today, I am going to talk about a very important religious thinker and political activist, Muḥammad Jawād Mughniyya, who passed away in 1979 at the cusp of the Islamic Revolution, probably 2 months before the success of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Okay. Muḥammad Jawād Mughniyya said while he was in Iran that a man had asked him whether he was a marja'u taqlid in his country. And he answered him, "How do you suppose I could be one when I refuse to accept legal monies, حقوق شرعية, or distribute them? Haven't you seen that I have no entourage, I have no followers, I act spontaneously and walk freely like others in the market. I buy my own grocery, and when I get tired, I sit like any other person on the side of the street." Embellished by his admirers and opponents alike, the image of the Red Sheikh had stuck to Muḥammad Jawād Mughniyya from the time when he started publishing essays against colonialism, capitalism, and American intervention in the Arab world, until his assertion that Imam Hadith and Imam Ali's statements express a preference for a socialist system with some minor modification. Mughniyya expressed a fierce opposition to the large landholders and forged friendships with a number of communists. He also clashed with the famous, none other than Sayyid Musa Sadr, who disappeared around 1978. And Sayyid Musa Sadr, much like Sayyid Muhsin al-Hakim Tabatabai, made it his aim to dismantle a culture of Shia leftist resistance to the state. Mughniyya had insisted that clerics must shun worldly posts and material gain, but also end a long tradition of indifference to the socio-political and economic grievances of the common person. In some respect, he shared the views of Sheikh Murtaza Ansari and Mirza Husseini Naini, that the jurist was morally obligated to play an active role in society, not merely through the implementation of the Sharia and the Ahkam, but also by addressing the grievances of the common person, the common believer. Neutrality, as Mughniyya saw it, was nothing but a discourse used by the powerful Maraja against anti-colonial and anti-state resistance in pursuit of justice. Justice was a very central concept in the thought of Mughniyya. The cleric must join force with existing civil activists without at any point pursuing an Islamic state, any form of system of governance, in the name of the Mahdi or otherwise. In this lecture, I shed light on the shift in Mughniyya's approach toward an Islamic system of government and the Sharia as a source of economic legislation. I also discuss his complex engagement with communism, having adopted the socio-economic demands of local communists, but rejected historical materialism and the ephemeral place it accords to religious morality. Finally, I also examine the connection, or lack thereof, between his legal rulings and his call for reform and their implications. Sometime during 1925, Mughniyya traveled to Najaf's Hawza from his hometown Tayr Dibba in Jabal Amil, South Lebanon, which was being annexed from Syria and attached to Grand Liban under the French mandate. Mughniyya's recollections of that period include images of political turmoil and economic hardships. While in Najaf, he seemed to have expressed a strong attachment to Jabal Amil, and after the independence of Lebanon in 1946, he articulated two intertwined national sentiments, one toward the young Lebanese polity and the other toward the Arab world, with the Palestinian cause at the center. Despite the support he received from his brother Abdul Karim, Mughniyya was in dire straits while in Najaf. He would emphasize nonetheless, in the tone of the Sufis, the virtues inculcated by hunger. You know, the Sufis talk about fadilatul jua, and I see a little bit of that in the writings of Mughniyya. That when one is liberated from his or her stomach, as he says, one attains a light in the heart, a knowledge, a new way of viewing the world. In another place, he states that he was the poorest student in Najaf and that his teacher, Sayyid Hussein al-Hammami, who died in 1959, a local Iraqi scholar, was the poorest teacher. The resemblance between Mughniyya and al-Hammami soon became clear to me. Al-Hammami was an austere scholar who criticized the powerful Maraja who had ties to the British or the government or the Shah of Iran, like Muhsin al-Hakim Tabatabai, and who had used his post and influence to ostracize his opponents within the seminary and suppress national and leftist sentiments. Al-Hammami was also called Nasiru al-Shuyu'iyyin, the supporter of the communists, for his study circle, like that of Sheikh Musa Du'aybil, who were friends, was filled with the poor and the working classes. That's what the workers, that's what Mughniyya wrote. Al-Hakim and his allies launched a scathing attack on Al-Hammami, and when the latter passed away, Al-Hakim refused to allow his son to bury him in the nave in Al-Riwaq of Al-Hadra Al-Haydariya. He was thus forced to bury his father in the mosque known as Murad, in Najaf. Through his relationship to Al-Hammami, Mughniyya came to validate the sensibilities of local scholars who refused to be coerced by the powerful Maraja and thus maintained their integrity and independence throughout their lives. And probably you can add to that their marginality, right? They kind of celebrated and accepted their marginality. Mughniyya emerged from Najaf's Hawza as a mujtahid and went back to Jabal Amil in 1936, acting as a prayer leader in the town of Ma'raka and later Tayr Harfa, very close to Upper Galilee, Al-Jalil al-A'la. So, the Palestinian and the South Lebanese traditions were really intertwined. He noted comically that he carried loads of egotism and arrogance, having expected people to bow to his knowledge simply because he wore a turban and grew a beard. He learned how well people shunned religious scholars, he would say, and complained about them, but also how little the scholars concerned themselves with their needs. Mughniyya became a judge at the Higher Appellate Court in Beirut in 1948. In 1949, he rose to the rank of consultant judge, and from 1951 until 1956, he was the head of this court. As Mughniyya occupied these posts, the Lebanese government of Camille Chamoun had aligned itself with the US. So this was a critical moment in the history of Lebanon. Increasing American and British intervention in Arab politics and the suppression of communism, especially after the Truman Doctrine, the promulgation of the Truman Doctrine in 1948. And also, more importantly, this was taking place after the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and all of this ignited Arab anti-imperial and nationalist movements. The Minister of Justice, there were 3 different ministers of justice, and I couldn't know which one actually had a confrontation with Mughniyya. I mentioned the 3 of them in the footnote, but the important thing is that at that moment, the Minister of Justice appeared to have reprimanded Mughniyya in September 1952 for engaging in political debates. After having written an article attacking capitalism and feudalism. A year after, when Mughniyya rejected an invitation from the American embassy to visit a US air carrier near Beirut's shores, he was considered an enemy of the US and the Chamoun's government and started to receive threats against his life. He could not be easily intimidated and proceeded to publish essays against Israel, the US, the Eisenhower Project, and the Baghdad Pact. So you see actually an intensification of his political essays after that. Intelligence officers in Lebanon, in Beirut, harassed him, and a number of Shia Sunni political leaders branded him as a communist. Mughniyya responded by saying that throughout history, reactionaries and traitors have directed similar accusations against nationalists who fought for justice and freedom. And he gave the example of McCarthyism in the US. Prime Minister Abdullah al-Yafi attacked Mughniyya, saying, "We will rid the Muslim world from you." Meanwhile, other powerful politicians addressed him as, "You communist, you hater of the Shia, or yet, you Rafidi," which is the worst insult. Meanwhile, during that time, 2 powerful Shia deputies, Kadhim al-Khalil and Adil Usayran, joined force and succeeded in having him removed from his leadership post at the court in 1956. I don't have the time to go into the details of that because it's a long process and multidimensional. Mughniyya seemed to have retired from all his clerical posts in 1968. But in 1969, when Sayyid Musa Sadr founded the Supreme Islamic Shiite Council, he may have served on its board for a short time. It is not clear from the sources. I tried to figure out when he was engaged with that, and I couldn't get any specific dates. So for a short time, he was a member of that council, and then he clashed with Sayyid Musa. Mughniyya was suspicious of Sayyid Musa's self-promotion given his limited Hausa-based expertise in law and jurisprudence, usul al-fiqh. Sayyid Musa had strong ties also to the Marja, Sayyid Muhsin al-Hakim, Tabatabai, and gained the support of deputies, both Shia and Sunni, whom Mughniyya considered corrupt. Sayyid Musa had also defended the Shah of Iran the way al-Hakim had done. During this period, opponents and supporters of Sayyid Musa alike embellished Mughniyya's image further as the Red Sheikh, al-Sheikh al-Ahmar. Mughniyya and the Islamic State. Mughniyya was one of the earliest jurists to refute Khomeini's political theory of vilayat faqih. Temporal authority, he argued, belonged exclusively to the Imam, and the mujtahid, however knowledgeable he may be, does not have the jurisdiction to impose his political commands on believers. Every jurist suffers from a limited memory, from conceit, self-promotion, and partiality, and can be easily influenced by his class interests and his milieu. The mujtahid's scope of authority lay only in protecting the faith and implementing the injunctions of the Sharia. A jurist who lays claims to the type of temporal authority held earlier by Prophet Muhammad or the Imams is insane. These are his words. Is insane, majnoon, and ignorant, safih, and must be considered in legal terms a child or one with no rational discernment. He must be prevented from managing his own property, the way you have a qasir, legally incapacitated in terms of managing his or her property. Mughniyya seemed to have flirted, though, with the idea of an Islamic state before this time, though noting in a largely impressionistic way that it is the best form of rule. The Islamic State is for everyone, he would write, and it offers a superior system of governance to any modern state. Of course, this is a statement that you can see written by probably, every other cleric or every cleric. In its ideal form, according to him, an Islamic State guarantees that those in power would be imbued with loyalty, expertise, justice, and trustworthiness. He admits that for a short time, he entertained the wrong idea that the Sharia, through its universal and specific legal norms, can be the basis for issuing state laws. He realized, however, he says, that the Sharia does not enjoin a specific mode of production or a specific electoral system or polity. Nonetheless, he insisted that an Islamic way of life, if it is ever pursued, would seek to overcome poverty, exploitation, and injustice. In Mughniyya's later writings, a rejection of all forms of Islamic governance emerges. An Islamic State is a farce, and those who are calling for it are nothing but ignorant, turbaned scholars. This is how he calls them, who do not understand that millions of Muslims today, East and West, are divided into various nationalities, ethnicities, and ideologies. As for reform, Islah, this very difficult, very ambiguous term, it has been used by diverse scholars to pursue diverse aims. It carried, nonetheless, one could talk probably about maybe one common general element or maybe others. There is a valorization of selective features of secular modernism, selective, in connection to state or society or both. Mughniyya's ideas about reform, when I looked at them closely, I saw that reform for him fell in two areas. He talked about the reform of Hausa education, and the other was to reform the cleric's relationship to the dominant structure of power. With respect to education, Mughniyya supported the implementation of modern pedagogies and standardized methods of evaluation at the Hausa, but he did not really offer any specific vision. There was nothing, more than these general statements. As for legal renewal or reform, Mughniyya had an ambiguous approach toward it, as I will show shortly. And I think that this is really the core of the matter. This will help us delve into what his idea of reform really means. With respect to the structure of power, Mughniyya declared that the clerics have an obligation to stand with the poor against those who exploit them and oppress them. They must also distance themselves from the ruling elites, the deputies, and the ministers, channeling their activism in civil arenas and thus acting as ordinary citizens. He considered most of the clerics to be reactionary and self-serving, having contributed even to the crisis of unemployment among the Shia in Lebanon. More significant, however, was Mughniyya's attack on the institution of the marja'iyya itself and the cultivation of power and wealth which it generates, according to him. Indeed, by every measure of the term, Mughniyya's views on the marja'iyya are not reformist, I would say, but radical. He basically cuts his ties completely with it. There's nothing to reform there. Communist and Quranian justice. During the 1960s, Mughniyya was outspoken about rural poverty and marginal political representation among the Shia. Shia activists during that period appeared in a host of leftist organizations, most importantly, Al-Hizb al-Shuyu'i al-Lubnani, so the Lebanese Communist Party, the Party of Socialist Lebanon, and the Organization of Communist Action, Munazzamat al-Amal al-Shuyu'i. Numerous Shia unionists and leftists partook in civil and militant struggles against the state to reform the political system and improve labor conditions. Mughniyya had argued that Marxist concepts of justice were competing with Islam's tacit moral economy. When common Shiites described the Alid, Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, as a pristine socialist, Mughniyya protested, saying that Abu Dharr's sense of justice was Quranic Muhammadan, neither communist nor capitalist. Values of equality and social justice have their roots in Islam, and it is religion and not communism that is the natural basis for justice. At the same time, as he said these things, he also validated the struggles of the working classes on the basis of Imam Ali's words and deeds. Even in his attack of Marxist-Leninist materialism, Mughniyya was keen on distinguishing between the atheists, al-mulhidun, and the communists, al-shuyu'iyun. He seemed aware of the extent to which the communists in Iraq and Lebanon have been part of their local religious cultures, and that sacred Shia figures and symbols made a commanding and versatile appearance in their lives, in their essays, in their speeches and poetry. Poetry is another area that the Iraqi Shia of the South and the Lebanese Shia of the South seem to emphasize. I don't think that you will find in any biography of any main figure, a sentence that says, they went against poetry, or actually you will find that they composed poetry, which is another very interesting area one day I will explore. Mughniyya's attraction to communist ideas appears in his first book published in 1947, The Current Situation in Jabal Amil. He denounces the ruling oligarchy, as he calls it, and its indifference to the pitiful health, educational, and economic conditions in the South. He expresses also his outrage at the Shia deputies who coalesced with the French colonial administration against their own people, referring to a statement by Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, يُجْبَلُ الْمَرْءُ عَلَى كُلِّ طَبِيعَةٍ إِلَّا الْكَذِبْ وَالْخِيَانَةِ. A person's qualities can be shaped in various forms, except for deceit and betrayal. These are inborn. He provoked the wrath of his colleagues when he wrote that poverty does not issue forth from God or from nature. Rather, it is the outcome of immoral human actions and conditions. In his own defense, Mughniyya evoked again Imam al-Sadiq's statement that إِنَّ النَّاسَ لَوْ أَدُّوا زَكَاةَ أَمْوَالِهِمْ مَا بَقِيَ مُسْلِمٌ فَقِيرًا مُحْتَاجًا. If everyone paid their dues of alms, there will be no poor, needy Muslims. In another hadith also, إِنَّمَا يُؤْتَى الْفُقَرَاءُ فِيمَا أَتَوْا مِنْ مَنْعِ مَنْ مَنَعَهُمْ حُقُوقَهُمْ. Whatever harm the poor have experienced is caused by the rich people's denial of their rights. With such arguments, Mughniyya was taken to task about his allegedly pro-communist statements. One scholar attacked him vehemently for daring to mention the names of Marx and Lenin next to God's name in his Quranic exegesis at Tafsirul Kashif, to which he comically responded. Of course, he loved sarcasm and he used it a lot. So he comically responded, God Almighty is mentioned in the sacred book, not in my commentary. In this exegesis, Mughniyya addresses the communists' view that bestowing infallibility on the Imam is irrational and it undermines critical reflection. He argues that the communists too believe in the infallibility of Marx and Lenin, and they consider them to be authoritative guides, hujjas, to the truth, whether they admit it or not. To be sure, Mughniyya devoted much attention during the 1960s to rethinking a socialist economic system within the rubric of Islam. He starts out saying rhetorically that both capitalist and communist systems are not acceptable. Then he, the way he lays out the argument is very interesting. Then he retreats from this position, noting that Islam neither accepts nor rejects a socialist system. He then retreats again from this position. It's a very interesting display of arguments. Then he retreats again from this position to argue that the moral principles which Islam truly embodies point to socialism. And he brings support to this declaration through a host of hadith reports. And he starts with the prophetic hadith, لا تجمعوا ما لا تأكلون ولا تبنوا ما لا تسكنون. Do not amass what you do not eat and do not build what you will not inhabit. It should be noted, I would like to note that this hadith has been transmitted by a few scholars and Sufi sheikhs. But when you look at the most authoritative hadith scholars, they will consider it to be weak or fabricated. And this will give you an idea to the extent to which Mughniyya went to support his position that the prophetic hadith and that the Imami hadith support a socialist system. He also goes to Nahjul Balagha and says that Imam Ali had stated, فَمَا جَاعَ فَقِيرٌ إِلَّا بِمَا مُتِّعَ بِهِ غَنِيٌّ. No poor has gone hungry except due to what a rich person has amassed. Again, turning also to Ahd of Imam Ali to Malik al-Ashtar. God stands with the lowest class, among those who are helpless, the poor and the needy and the wretched and disabled. Mughniyya goes on to assert that Islamic society welcomes socialism if some form of privatization, if some form of semi-independent commercial enterprises can be pursued with government protection so that the government would prevent exploitation and monopoly. Islam, he added, rejects all claims of class superiority, tabaqiyya, which is why religious scholars must shun pompous titles and luminous posts that serve those in power. Much like the secularists and the communists, Mughniyya emphasized national rights and citizenry over sectarian rights. He attacked the notion of huquq al-ta'ifa, the sect's rights, raised by the Shia deputies to speak on behalf of the masses, noting, he basically declared that a Shia deputy is obligated to treat all the Lebanese equally, which is a very interesting position. In this last section of my lecture, I'm going to turn to the question of legal reform, because unless we go there, we really don't understand what reform is all about. If there is such a reform, actually, it's questionable. Piety, patriarchy, and legal renewal at the Ja'fari courts. Mughniyya tried to negotiate a partnership with the modern secular state whereby it would have total control over the mu'amalat, the transactions, contracts, because according to him, rulings tied to them are quite broad and appear as recommendations. Inspired by his friend, none other than the Mufti of Egypt, Mahmoud Shaltut, he argued that transactions were originally based on urf, and thus on custom, and thus can be easily integrated or removed by the state, with one significant exception: contracts of marriage. And that is, in conclusion, also in connection, divorce. A marriage contract, he noted, is closer to an act of worship, ibadah. For in the Quran, in Surah An-Nisa, verse 21, it is described as a weighty contract. This is how he understands it, being inspired by the Mufti Mahmoud Shaltut. وَأَخَذْنَا مِنْكُمْ مِيثَاقًا غَلِيظًا. Again, Shaltut's opinion that but I just want to note that other exegetes did not understand it as the way Shaltut and Mughniyya understood it. They understood the term ghalidh not as weighty, but simply as confirmed, as a contract that's confirmed, right? Ratified. For clerics like him, like Mughniyya, family law with its patriarchal features was confirmed as the last bastion of piety in a secular society, a space where God's will would be fulfilled. Under the modern state, the Sharia was trimmed down to the personal status laws pertaining to only one type of marriage, one type of divorce, child custody, and inheritance. Thus, together, the Ja'fari court and the state administration shaped a new patriarchy that became emboldened in the face of grievances and attack across social class. Indeed, managing family law, the remnants of the Sharia under the state, became the cleric's raison d'etre. Mughniyya's approach to marriage destabilized his discourse on social reform and revealed the limits of his ijtihadic discourse. When a group of women approached Mughniyya in 1952 to question a man's right to physically discipline a recalcitrant wife in connection to the Quranic verse, نشزت وتمردت. Nashazat became recalcitrant, tamarradat protested, disobeyed. He decided to write an article, even, we can go into the linguistic hermeneutics of tamarrada that can mean many, many, many things. But I'm going to focus on how he treated this question. He writes, right? So he went back and wrote an article. The women came to his house and they said, we're very troubled by the legitimacy of a man, the act of man disciplining his wife to the extent of using force, of hitting her or things like that. He writes about it later in an article and says that Imam Ali, so he says what he didn't say to these women, that Imam Ali is known to have declared, al-mar'atu sharrun la budda minhu. Al-mar'atu, and also to have written, al-mar'atu sharrun kulluha wa sharru ma fiha annahu la budda minha. A woman is evil, a necessary evil, and that a woman is pure evil, and the worst aspect about her is that the man cannot live without her. Without evaluating the type of proofs these statements carried, and they appear in Nahjul Balagha, not in any hadith collection, Mughniyya proceeds to build a whole legal theological argument about the essential evilness of women as well as their ignorance. He does not delve into the exegetical difference even between the universal and the particular in illuminating the context of these statements. We do not see linguistic hermeneutics in play, where, for instance, evil can be located in male desire or in turning the woman into an object of desire. We also do not see an exercise in ijtihadi reasoning. So really, we do not see a mujtahid at work that may take us through intratextual evidence, extratextual evidence. For instance, an extratextual evidence would be the actual practice of Imam Ali, right? His actual deeds, his practice toward his wife, toward Fatima Zahra. Rather, he turns to the story of Adam and Eve in the Quranic qasas, in the stories, noting that Adam had bargained with God over accepting the company of Eve, declaring in the end that she is a necessary evil. This story, in his view, confirms that God has willed not only male guardianship over women, but male superiority. The qasas, the stories, do not carry the kind of indicance needed by the mujtahid to pursue his legal inference to begin with. The stories have been approached by some scholars not as factual accounts, but as examples, let's say, of cosmological truths. Not to mention, I don't want to go into the controversy surrounding the Israeliyat, the Islamo-biblical legends. It was within, what I want to say here is that it was within Mughniyya's hermeneutical reach to investigate the status of these, at-turath al-riwa'i, the inherited statements from Nahj al-Balagha. Let us turn, now I want to take this and turn to a particular legal issue that he treated, that he approached, and he was known to have given his opinion on it. And that is child custody, al-hadana. Medieval Shia jurists were divided into several groups over the age of the child upon custody by the mother or the father. The first group argued that the mother has custody rights until the child is 2 years old or even less. But it is preferable, based on caution on what is awla, that the female child stays with her mother until the age of 7. The second group argued that the mother has the right of custody until the child is 7 years old, be it male or female, right? Then we have other groups distinguishing between male and female. A third group gave the mother absolute custody over the child as long as she does not remarry. All of them, of course, this is all conditional upon the fact that she does not remarry. And this is based on a hadith by Imam as-Sadiq, relied upon by Shaykh al-Saduq. A fourth opinion entails that the mother gains absolute custody of the female child as long as she does not remarry, and gains custody of the male child until he reaches the age of 7. And this is expressed by one of the scholars of Al-Qadimain, Ibn al-Junayd. A fifth opinion in that is that the mother has custody of the female child until the age of 9 and of the male child until the age of 7, as is reflected in the opinions of the Qadi, Ibn al-Barraj, al-Tarabulusi. A sixth opinion expressed by Shaykh al-Mufid and his student Sallar is that the mother gains custody of the male child until the age of 2 and the female child until the age of 9. A seventh and last opinion is that in case of a deep disagreement between the parents, the father can have custody of the male child during the first 2 years if a wet nurse breastfeeds the child rather than the mother. And this is the opinion of Al-Muhaqqiq Yusuf al-Bahrani. So these are the types of opinions, the different opinions that were present, available to Mughniyya at that time. Today, we have actually many, many more different opinions. What is important to stress here is that the ijma'at, the jurist consensus record, is contradictory. And the akhbar, the hadith, and the hadith are also contradictory, which give the mujtahid, theoretically speaking, a range of hermeneutical tools to produce a legal ruling. The legal position of Mughniyya on child custody is marked deliberately by contradictory layers of legal social argumentation. He starts out with a bold declaration that there is no authoritative textual proof for either of these rulings. He said that the diverse fatwas are the outcome of an ambiguous and random joining of weak hadith reports that carry no proofs by way of illuminating sharia or even urfi laws. Immediately after, though, he gives the mother custody of the child until the age of 2. Like, he reverts to the most conservative position. And then after that, he says he will leave it to the judge to decide if the child is to stay with her or the father based on maslaha, that term that we have used to say something about the renewal of the law. It can also be, in this case, left in the hands of the judge, and thus there is no real sense of what maslaha means for the child. What is maslaha for the child? Mughniyya does not furnish the child with the judge with a ruling, knowing only well that when facing controversy, the judge and the committee he consults with will revert to the most widely practiced. That is the mashhur, and the mashhur is explained legally. The mashhur is not authoritative. Legally, the mashhur is a precautionary obligation. You take it because it is the most prevalent, and you take it as a precaution, and it becomes obligatory in its precautionary state. It is upheld as the safest position whenever uncertainty about consensus and hadith arise. It bespeaks of the objective and subjective limitations placed on discursivity when preserving the gender discrimination, that in a way there is a coalescence between the Ja'fari court and the state. And it is also at the same time, I mean, that's the complexity, that this is presented as a preservation of God's will itself. By taking the marriage contract as closer to the ibadat, then you create that whole different approach to these laws. In summary, so I'm going to summarize and end the talk. Mughniyya's legacy lies probably not in promoting a coherent vision of legal renewal and social reform, but in his intuitive, pietistic, and passionate commitment to socio-economic justice. He was relentless in his critique of the fusion of wealth and power at the heart of the marja'iyya and his pessimism about the mujtahid's political commitments. In October 2019, an unprecedented wave of uprisings spread in all parts of Lebanon. Unemployment levels in Lebanon had already reached 30%. For years, the Lebanese have endured all forms of theft, deterioration in standards of living, the destruction of the environment, committed by various ministers, bureaucrats, deputies across sect. It was described by many as an epidemic. It was not tied to the politician you hated, but the one you actually voted for. It was everywhere. When I went to Beirut a few months after, I couldn't help ask, if Mughniyya was alive, what position would he have taken? I think that he would have presented a much needed third way against the deeply polarized Shia and Sunni clerics, not only in Lebanon, but also Syria and Iraq. He would have continued to advocate activism against unjust rulers and corrupt state officials, be they the Ba'ath of Iraq or Syria, right, or others. And yet he would have never agreed to the normalization of Israeli apartheid, as we have seen recently under the UAE. Mughniyya would have also legitimized civil disobedience. At the same time, he would have seen clearly through the neoliberal NGO slogans raised during the uprisings, funded generously by the Trump administration, and he would have called instead for a local grassroots struggle against the government. Mughniyya would have confronted the two most powerful Shia political parties, Amal and Hezbollah, with their responsibilities in contributing to the crisis. Mughniyya, finally, would have been ostracized, much like a Sayyid al-Hammami in Najaf, but he would have been content to embrace his own marginality. Thank you.